Welcome everyone to the Method Support Unit's May web clinic, and today we're going to be going through Risk of Bias 2 with you. Just some housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking, and please keep your camera off to reduce the bandwidth. And if you want to ask a question, please feel free to put your camera on and raise your hand, or type it in the chat as well. And we really want this to be interactive, so we want everyone to be able to feel that they can talk and chip in and ask questions or give their experience as well. And that's what these web clinics were created for. So first of all, I'm going to close that down. Oh yeah, sorry, just to note that this webinar will be recorded as well and made available on our website. So I hope everyone is okay with that. So Rachel, can you see the new screen on Risk of Bias 2?
Yes, Carrie.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm not sure how Zoom changes the sharing. So on the Cochrane Methods website, we have under Methods in Cochrane, we have a page on Risk of Bias 2. And if you go to this page, you can scroll down and it's got details from when we did the pilot over the last few years, and it has a starter pack with lots of useful information in. And there's also a web page on frequently asked questions, so that's probably your first port of call if you have any particular questions. And also the webinar series that we ran as well. So that just takes you directly to the Cochrane Learning web pages that has all of the Risk of Bias 2 webinars. So there was, the first one was an introduction to Risk of Bias 2, and then we had one webinar for each domain, and then we had one on overall risk of bias, and one on crossover and cluster trials as well. And then we had an editorial considerations webinar. So if you want more details about the particular domains, that would be a really good place to go to. So this webinar today really is just to talk about how we write up Risk of Bias 2. So another useful thing we created during the pilot was the editorial checklist, and that's what I'm going to show you now. And then my colleague Rachel Richardson, who's an editor at Cochrane, is going to go through and show you some examples. So this is just a Word document that has checklists, and this is what we use when we're reviewing protocols and full reviews. So hopefully you can see this, this document. And there's a checklist for protocols. So I'll just run that through that with you. Can you see it okay, Rachel? Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so the first thing is in the method section. It's important to state that Risk of Bias 2 will be used and reference it. State your effective interest. So for Risk of Bias 2, it's important to state whether you're going to look at the effective assignment or the effective adherence, because that affects which signalling questions that you need to answer in domain 2. So we ask that you ideally specify that in the protocol. It's important to list or refer to the results that will be assessed using Risk of Bias 2, including the outcome measures and time points as well, because Risk of Bias 2 is a results-based tool. So rather than assessing the risk of bias of the study as a whole, as previous tools have done, you're looking at specific outcomes. And then we also ask to state how you will handle crossover and cluster trials as well. So there is an extension to the Risk of Bias 2 tool to crossover and cluster trials. So each of them have an additional domain on top of the domains in the tool for parallel trials. And then, as you normally would do, we ask you to state who will assess Risk of Bias 2, how many, and whether it's independently and in duplicate. And to list the domains of the tool, as you would have done for previous tools as well, and the judgment options. So for Risk of Bias 2, it's high, some concerns, and low risk of bias. And it's also important to state how overall risk of bias is reached. So for example, using the signalling questions and the algorithm, which gives you the overall risk of bias. And usually that is if all of the domains for a particular outcome and study are low risk, then the overall risk of bias would be low risk. If one or more are of some concerns, but not high risk, then the overall risk of bias would be some concerns. And if one or more of the domains were high risk, or 4 of the domains were of some concerns, then it would give you a high risk of bias. It is possible to overturn the algorithm. So if you use the Excel spreadsheets as available on the riskofbias.info website, that will give you the overall risk of bias, but you as a reviewer could choose a different risk of bias, but we would ask you to justify that. State if you plan to use any tools to manage the assessment of bias using risk of bias too. So as I've already mentioned, there is a really helpful Excel tool on the risk of bias website, and within that, on one sheet, you can list all of your studies and outcomes for each study. In the data synthesis section, it's important to state whether you will undertake a meta-analysis for all of the studies, no matter their risk of bias, and then whether you will consider risk of bias as a subgroup analysis or sensitivity analysis in those sections. And then in the method section for summary of findings tables, you state how you would use the risk of bias to assessments to inform grade, and that's usually looking at the overall risk of bias.
Sorry, Kerry. We've had a question through on the chat.
Okay. Can you read it? I can
yeah, I can read it. From Alison. What if you have more than one outcome? Do you have to do this process for each and every outcome? I guess she's referring to the risk of bias to assessment.
Yeah, so because the risk of bias 2 tool is result based, yes, you would have to do it for each study that reports that outcome. So you might have several assessments per study, and that is because assessing the risk of bias would inform how reliable the result is in the meta-analysis for that particular outcome. And in Cochrane, we recommend that at least those that are going to be included in the summary of findings table should be assessed, because we appreciate that some reviews include a lot of outcomes, so this could be a lot of work. But you do need the risk of bias to inform grade, which is used in the summary of findings tables. And usually in Cochrane, it's 7 outcomes included in the summary of findings tables. So at least for those outcomes, yes, you would need to assess it. Domain 1 of the tool is about randomization. So that's study-based. So that would be the same across all outcomes for one study. And then the others would be a bit different, because you're talking about deviations from the intervention, missing outcome data, the measurement of the outcome, and then the selection of the reported result. So they are dependent on the outcome that you're considering. However, across the review, things may be similar for a domain for the different trials when you're looking at one outcome. If a particular outcome is measured in a particular way, that domain 4 might be very similar in that all of the outcomes are measured in one way. So although it seems like it's quite a lot, actually, when you get started with it, you can see the pattern across the different outcomes. So that's the protocol checklist that we've developed. So I know a lot of the managing editors in the review groups have been using this checklist tool and working with us in the method support unit to check the protocols. So if anyone has any questions or comments on this in the particular method section, please feel free to ask or share your experience. I'm always happy to hear people's experiences, good or bad.
Hi, Kerry. Elizabeth Royal here. Just to say that we have found the copy editors have found that there are a lot of grammatical errors and spelling errors that get copied and copied and copied for each outcome, for each trial, when the decision is the same. So I really would encourage anybody using this to have their Excel file checked before they put it all into RevMan to get the spelling and the grammar right, because it is far too time consuming for the copy editors to copy edit Risk of Bias 2 judgments. Although we do Risk of Bias 1 judgments, we can't do it, and we can't do it thoroughly in RevMan Web. So really just to encourage reviewers to get what they're putting into their review checked before they put it in, so that it is right, because it isn't going to be checked later. Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a really helpful tip. We've got some questions in the chat as well. So Risk of Bias 2 is used with grade only. No, you can use different, some people are still using the original Risk of Bias tool, which also can inform grades. So it's not just Risk of Bias 2. So in Cochrane at the moment, you can use either the original tool or the Risk of Bias 2 tool. Rachel will show you how it's displayed in a forest plot, and then you can use that to help you in your interpretation of the result. Sorry if I have misunderstood this. Should there be an overall statement per outcome, or is this per study for Risk of Bias 2? It is per outcome for Risk of Bias 2, yes. And we'll show you that in an actual review soon. I'm just going through the checklist at the moment. So then we go on to the checklist for the reporting the review. So this will just help, it helps editors, but it also can help authors look to see what they need to include in each section as well. So again, include all of the Risk of Bias 2 considerations from the protocol in the method section. So this is the full review. So that should really already be there from the protocol. State the version of the Risk of Bias 2 tool that was used. So at the moment, there's the 2019 version that's available, but just in case this is updated in the future, we just say to mention that version. And then in the Risk of Bias and Included Studies section in the results, so this is where it differs. So previously, people referred to the different domains for the original Risk of Bias tool, but because this is results level, we're asking people to summarize it by outcome. And as I said, Rachel will show you an example of that. And it's important to state how the detailed Risk of Bias assessments data can be accessed. So we do ask that people upload their Excel file with their decisions into an online repository, for example, and put that link into the review. And then there is a Risk of Bias table as well within RevMan, but that doesn't have the answers to the signalling questions stored in. It just has a summary for each domain. And again, we will show you that. And as I said, we need to provide a brief overview of the Risk of Bias assessments. So because it's result-based, we do suggest that you summarise by outcome, because one outcome might be low risk of bias for all studies, but another outcome may be high risk, and it's important to differentiate that for each outcome. However, if it's very similar across outcomes, then it is possible to summarise it overall. And in the effects of intervention section, you can refer to the forest plots that have the traffic lights included in them. And these are now just included as standard within your PDF. When you publish, you don't need to add it as an additional figure. And if you're undertaking synthesis without meta-analysis or a narrative synthesis, you can still undertake risk of bias assessments as well. And we suggest that you just have the overall risk of bias assessment within the table. And then it's important to present any results from subgroup analyses or sensitivity analyses based on risk of bias. And we do suggest, or it is recommended, that you only base this on the overall risk of bias and not on individual domains. And then we're thinking about the certainty of the evidence in the discussion section. You can bring bring the overall risk of bias for the different outcomes into this section. So that's it for the checklists. I'm going to hand over to Rachel now to just go through some examples with you, and then I'll demonstrate RevMan Web and the interactive risk of bias tables. Over to you, Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm going to bring up my slides now. Oh, sorry, apologies.
Hi, Angela. Sorry, I've just seen your comments as well. Apologies if you couldn't see the
tables
very well. Yes, I'll put the link to the website onto the chat so people can access the Word document.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hopefully you can see my slides now.
Nope, sorry, Rachel.
Oh no, hold on, bear with me.
Yes, you can see it
now. Oh,
yeah.
Brilliant. I'm sorry about that. Hi, everybody. So as Kerry said, I'm just going to briefly, oops, that's gone a bit far. I'm going to briefly talk through how the risk of bias 2 write-up looks in an actual review. And so most of the examples I'm using are from this review, physical activity interventions for people with congenital heart disease. And this was the first review that was published on the Cochrane Library using risk of bias 2. Okay, so as Kerry said, when part of the checklist for writing up reviews refers to the information that you include in your methods section. And of course, the your method section from your protocol then gets transferred into the review when you write it up and when you summarize the methods that you used in the review. So the first place we'd expect to see a write-up about risk of bias is in your assessment of risk of bias section in the methods. And I'll talk through each of the features that we want to see in this section. So first of all, we want to see the version of the tool referenced. So as you can see in this review, the authors have shown when they access the review, which tells you which version they used. Next, we want people to say which effect they're examining when they're applying risk of bias. So are they examining the effect of assignment to an intervention, or are they examining the effect of adherence to an intervention? And for this review, the authors are looking at the effect of assignment, the intention to treat effect. We also want to see what outcomes they're going to apply the risk of bias 2 tool, the risk of bias 2 tool to. And as you can see, the authors here have only got sort of 4 or 5 outcomes. And as Kerry said, it's really important to kind of limit the amount of outcomes that you apply the tool to, because it's a results-based tool. It can take quite a while. You're looking at each result for each study individually. So it's a really good idea to kind of limit the outcomes. And usually I say, limit the outcomes that you're looking at to what's in your summary of findings tables. So looking at your key comparisons and then your key outcomes for those comparisons. The next issue Kerry mentioned was about if you're using cluster randomized trials or crossover trials in your review. Now, this physical interventions review didn't have any cluster trials, and they included one crossover trial, but they only used the data from that trial prior to the crossover. So in that kind of situation, you're okay to only use the standard ROB2 tool. You don't need to use the specialized one for crossovers. So that's why they've not mentioned it here. And so the next, sorry, my slides aren't moving on. I'm not quite sure why. I'll try something else. Oh, there we go. So that's, as Kerry said, we want to see, as you'd expect in a standard Cochrane review, who's done the assessment and how's it been done. So those 2 review authors there independently assess the risk of bias. They've listed the domains, as Kerry said. So those 5 key domains from risk of bias 2.
Rachel, sorry to interrupt. Someone's asked if you can increase the font size.
Gosh, I'm not sure I can.
You change review to 100% to see that. I mean, I don't know. I can see it. I can see it okay on my screen, but I don't think some people are struggling. If people get rid of the videos,
yeah, if you lose your thumbnails, that gets it a bit bigger for you.
If you look at if you go to your top of your screen on the right hand side and go to view and standard, you can get rid of all the names and things, so that should be able to make it bigger. Sorry, I'm talking to the participants, Rachel, not you.
That's fine. Sorry about that. I'll make sure I read out what I'm referring
to. That's working. So thanks, Rachel.
Okay. So as Kerry said, we want to see how you're going to use the signalling questions to determine the risk of bias for each result. And the final thing we want to see is how you're going to manage all these assessments, because you'll be generating a lot of data. These authors haven't mentioned using the Excel tool, and I'm assuming because this was such an early one actually that probably the Excel tool wasn't around just then, because I know it sort of came in a bit later. So yeah,
we were still learning at this point as well, Rachel. The first review of what ideally people should include in the text.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on. The next part where we want to see you talk about ROB2 is in data synthesis. And I'll just click on. This example is actually from a protocol I've used, and I've put the reference there. And so, as you can see, what the authors have said here is that they're planning to include all the studies in the primary analysis, regardless of risk of bias, and then they're going to explore the effect of risk of bias in a sensitivity analysis. So alternatively, some authors might choose to only use low risk of bias studies in the primary analysis, and that's okay. As long as you sort of explain and justify why you think that's a sensible approach. The next area is in the subgroup and sensitivity analyses sections of the methods. And if you can see here, the authors of the physical interventions review are planning to examine risk of bias as a categorical variable in a meta-regression to look at its effect as a treatment modifier. And in terms of a sensitivity analysis, they're going to remove high risk of bias studies from the meta-analyses to see what impact that has on their effect estimates. And finally, summary of findings. We'd like to see authors discuss how their risk of bias 2 assessments are going to feed into their summary of findings tables. And here the authors have discussed how they're going to downgrade depending on what proportion of the evidence comes from in sort of studies at varying risks of bias. And we'll show how that looks. I'll show how that looks in a little bit. So a top tip when you're writing up your review is when you look at your forest plots, as Kerry was saying, you'll get your risk of bias traffic lights on the right hand side. So if you look at the risk of bias legend, that summarizes your judgments for each of the risk of bias domains, for each of those individual results. So for example, the result from the Morrison trial in 2013 had some concerns for 4 of the key domains, and it had a low risk of bias for one domain, domain B, which is deviations from intended interventions. So the overall risk of bias for that result, for that study, was some concerns, and you can see that in column F. So those traffic lights give you a really nice feel for you know, for what the risks of bias are for those results. And also, when you look at the weight that each contributes to the meta-analysis, you get a feel for how much of the evidence in a particular meta-analysis is, you know, is coming from a particular result. So moving on to the results. So you want to show. Sorry, I've lost my thread. You want to show who assessed the risk of bias, and again, sort of which version of the tool you've used, and then you want to refer to the risk of bias tables and how to find the detailed information in those tables. And I've just highlighted with that arrow where the authors have they've put all their detailed information in a separate on a separate website, because obviously you generate a lot of information. You don't want to include it all in your review, but you want readers to be able to access it if they'd like to sort of dig into how you made your judgments. And these are how the risk of bias tables look when your review is published. And Kerry will take you through how those work and how readers can click on things to get information when she comes back. You want to give a brief overview of the assessment. So as you can see here, the authors have looked at each outcome individually. So for example, the spasticity outcome, and they give you some information about how they made a judgment of the risk of bias for that outcome. We want authors to refer to the visual representations of the risk of bias assessments. So as you can see here, if you refer to readers to the forest plots, they can see those traffic lights, which summarize the risk of bias assessments per result, per outcome. This is how authors have shown the results of their subgroup and sensitivity analyses according to risk of bias. So the top box shows a subgrouping by risk of bias. So the authors here have grouped studies at low risk of bias, results at low risk of bias, results at some concerns, and results of high risk of bias. And they've tried to work out whether there is whether these subgroups make a difference. Does it look like these are having different effects on the result? And then the sensitivity analysis paragraph at the bottom is summarising their results when they've taken particular studies at high risk of bias out of their results and shown how that affects their overall result. And then in their discussion section, the authors here have discussed how the risk of bias judgments has affected their grade considerations. So how they've applied the risk of bias to determine whether they downgrade a result or don't downgrade a result for that consideration. And another top tip is in the quality of evidence section, quite often we find authors just discussing risk of bias in this section, but actually it's important in this section to discuss all of your grade domains. So to discuss imprecision, inconsistency, publication bias, as well as your risk of bias judgment.